In 1985, a plane carrying one of Africa's most prominent political figures vanished without a trace over the Indian Ocean. There was no distress call, no confirmed wreckage, no final message to explain what went wrong. For years, search teams found nothing that could definitively explain the disappearance. It was as if the aircraft and everyone on board had simply been erased from existence. To this day, what truly happened remains one of the most debated mysteries in African history. Disappearances like this carry a different kind of weight. Unlike confirmed deaths, they leave behind something unfinished. No clear ending, no closure. Just fragments of evidence, conflicting reports, and unanswered questions that continue to echo decades later. Across Africa, continent shaped by vast landscapes, complex political histories, and regions where documentation has not always been consistent, some disappearances have taken on almost myth-like status. Not because they are fictional, but because the lack of definitive answers allows speculation to grow over time. And among the most mysterious is the disappearance of Samora Machel, the first president of independent Mozambique. On October 19, 1986, Machel was returning from a diplomatic meeting in Zambia when his Soviet-built Tupolev aircraft crashed in the Lebombo Mountains, near the border between South Africa and Mozambique. At first, it appeared to be a tragic but straightforward aviation accident, but almost immediately, questions began to surface. Why had the aircraft deviated from its intended route? Why did experienced pilots fail to correct the course? And why did the crash occur so close to South African territory during one of the most politically tense periods in the region? At the time, South Africa was under apartheid rule and Mozambique, under Machel, was openly opposed to it. The geopolitical tension added a layer of suspicion that transformed the crash from an accident into a potential act of sabotage. One of the most widely discussed theories suggests that a false navigation beacon may have been used to mislead the aircraft, causing the pilots to unknowingly change course. According to this theory, the plane followed incorrect signals, gradually drifting off its intended path until it was too late to recover. Other investigations pointed to possible pilot error, technical malfunction, or a combination of factors. Official reports offered conclusions, but none were universally accepted. Each explanation seemed to answer some questions while leaving others unresolved. Survivors of the crash added even more complexity. Some described confusion in the cockpit during the final moments, while others hinted at circumstances that did not fully align with a simple accident scenario. Over the years, multiple inquiries were conducted, including international investigations. Yet despite all efforts, no single explanation has been able to completely eliminate doubt. What makes this case so enduring is not just the disappearance itself, but the context surrounding it. A head of state, a politically volatile region, conflicting evidence, and a timeline filled with uncertainties. Samora Machel's death was confirmed, but what truly caused it was never definitively proven. And that is what transforms a tragedy into a mystery. Because sometimes what disappears is not just a person, but the truth behind what really happened. In 1961, one of the most powerful men in Africa boarded a plane, attempting to escape a political crisis that was rapidly spiraling out of control. He never reached his destination. The aircraft disappeared into the night over Central Africa, and what followed would become one of the most controversial and mysterious disappearances of the 20th century. The man was Dag Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General of the United Nations. At the time, the Congo crisis had turned the newly independent Democratic Republic of Congo into a battleground of competing interests. Foreign powers, mining corporations, political factions, and Cold War tensions all collided in a conflict that was far more complex than it appeared on the surface. Hammarskjöld had taken a direct role in trying to negotiate peace, placing himself in the middle of one of the most volatile situations in the world. On the night of September 17, 1961, his plane, a Douglas DC-6, was flying toward Ndola in what is now Zambia. The mission was highly sensitive. Hammarskjöld was scheduled to meet with Moise Shom, a key political figure in the secessionist region of Katanga. The outcome of that meeting had the potential to shift the entire balance of the conflict. But the meeting never happened. Shortly before landing, the aircraft crashed in a forested area just outside Ndola. Wreckage was eventually found, along with the bodies of most of the passengers. At first, officials treated it as a tragic accident. But almost immediately, inconsistencies began to emerge. Witnesses reported seeing another aircraft in the sky that night. Some claimed there were flashes of light before the crash, suggesting a possible attack. Others described hearing explosions that did not align with a simple mechanical failure. One of the most disturbing details involved Hammarskjöld himself. His body was found away from the main wreckage, with reports suggesting unusual injuries that fueled speculation about what may have happened in the final moments. Official investigations at the time concluded that pilot error was the most likely cause. However, these conclusions were widely questioned. Critics pointed out gaps in the investigation, missing evidence, and testimonies that were either ignored or dismissed. Over the decades, new information continued to surface. Declassified documents, witness statements, and independent inquiries reopened the case multiple times. Some theories suggested that the plane may have been shot down, possibly by mercenaries or foreign operatives who had interests in the region's resources. Others pointed to the possibility of sabotage, arguing that Hammarskjöld's efforts to stabilize the Congo threatened powerful economic and political actors. In recent years, even the United Nations has revisited the case, acknowledging that there are still unanswered questions that justify further investigation. Despite all the attention, one fact remains unchanged. No definitive explanation has ever been proven. The disappearance of Dag Hammarskjöld is not just a mystery about a plane crash. It is a mystery shaped by geopolitics, hidden interests, and the possibility that the truth was never meant to be fully uncovered. Because sometimes, in moments where global power is at stake, answers do not disappear by accident. They disappear because someone made sure they would. In 2013, a well-known Tanzanian businessman left his home for what should have been a routine trip. There were no signs of distress, no threats reported, and no indication that anything unusual was about to happen. But somewhere along his journey, he vanished. No crash, no body, no confirmed sighting ever again. His name was Reginald Mengi, one of Tanzania's most influential entrepreneurs. Known for his media empire and high-profile presence in both business and public life. His disappearance didn't just shock the public because of who he was, but because of how completely he seemed to vanish. On the day he disappeared, Mengi was reportedly traveling under normal conditions, following a familiar route. There were no immediate signs of struggle or interruption. Yet, at some point, all contact with him stopped. His vehicle was later found, but without clear evidence of what had taken place. That alone would have been enough to raise suspicion. But what made the case far more unsettling was the lack of any reliable explanation. There were no credible ransom demands, no confirmed political motive, no clear criminal pattern. And despite his high profile, the investigation struggled to produce solid leads that could explain his disappearance in a definitive way. As days turned into weeks, speculation began to grow. Some believed it could have been a targeted kidnapping, possibly linked to business interests or undisclosed conflicts. Others suggested internal disputes, hidden financial pressures, or connections that had not been publicly known. In high-level circles, where influence and money intersect, not all conflicts are visible from the outside. Another theory pointed toward the possibility of a planned disappearance, though this was largely dismissed due to the absence of evidence suggesting he had prepared to vanish voluntarily. His life, businesses, and public presence did not indicate someone planning to walk away from everything. The most disturbing aspect, however, was the silence. In many disappearance cases, even when answers are unclear, fragments begin to emerge over time. Witnesses come forward. Evidence surfaces, patterns form. But in this case, the silence remained almost absolute. No confirmed trail. No reliable timeline after the last known moment. No closure. For a figure of his stature, this level of disappearance felt almost impossible. Someone so visible, so connected, simply gone without a trace in the modern era. It raised a deeper question. How does someone disappear completely in a world where movement is increasingly tracked, recorded, and monitored? The answer, perhaps, lies in the difference between visibility and vulnerability. Public figures may appear highly visible, but that does not necessarily make them immune to forces operating outside public view. Over time, the case faded from headlines, but not from memory. It remained one of those rare disappearances where the absence of answers became the defining feature of the story itself. Because when someone disappears without evidence, without explanation, and without resolution, the mystery does not just remain open, it becomes permanent. In 2011, during the chaos of the Libyan civil war, one of the most powerful intelligence figures in the country was captured by rebel forces. He had been one of the closest men to Muammar Gaddafi, a key architect of the regime's internal security and foreign operations. His name was Moussa Koussa. At first, his disappearance did not seem mysterious. In fact, it appeared almost public. Reports indicated that Koussa had defected, fleeing Libya as the Gaddafi regime began to collapse under pressure. He arrived in the United Kingdom, where officials confirmed his presence. For a brief moment, it seemed like a clear and documented transition from one side of history to another. And then, almost as quickly as he appeared, he vanished. There was no dramatic announcement, no official long-term statement explaining his status. After initial reports and a short period of media attention, information about his whereabouts became increasingly limited. Governments acknowledged his cooperation, but details were scarce, controlled, and often contradictory. For a man who once operated at the highest levels of intelligence, this sudden disappearance from public visibility raised immediate questions. Was he being protected? Was he being silenced? Or had he chosen to disappear completely? Moussa Koussa was not just another political figure. As Libya's former intelligence chief and foreign minister, he was believed to have deep knowledge of sensitive operations, including alleged links to international incidents and covert activities carried out during Gaddafi's rule. His potential testimony could have had significant implications, both for Libya and for foreign governments. That alone made his disappearance far more than a personal mystery. It became a geopolitical one. Some reports suggested that he was living under protection, possibly in exchange for cooperation with Western intelligence agencies. Others speculated that his movements were being deliberately concealed to avoid political complications or security risks. There were also darker theories. Some believed that Koussa knew too much, that his knowledge made him a liability in a world where certain truths are better left undisclosed. In this view, his disappearance was not an accident, but a controlled outcome designed to limit exposure. What makes this case particularly unusual is that, unlike other disappearances, there is no clear moment of loss, no crash, no crime scene, no single event where everything went wrong. Instead, there is a gradual fading, a transition from visibility to silence, and in many ways, that can be even more unsettling. Because when someone disappears suddenly, there is at least a moment to investigate, a point in time to analyze. But when someone slowly vanishes from public view, the lines become blurred. It becomes harder to distinguish between disappearance, protection, and intentional obscurity. Over time, Moussa Koussa became less of a person in the public eye and more of a question mark. Where is he? What does he know? And why has so little been confirmed about his life after leaving Libya? In a world of intelligence, secrecy is expected. But total silence usually means something more. In 1972, a high-ranking Moroccan political figure was kidnapped in the middle of Paris, one of the most surveilled cities in Europe. Witnesses saw him being forced into a car. The operation was fast, precise, and executed in broad daylight. Within minutes, he was gone. His name was Mehdi Ben Barka, and he was never seen again. Ben Barka was not just a politician. He was one of the most prominent opposition leaders to King Hassan II of Morocco, a figure with international influence who had connections across Africa, Europe, and the developing world. At the time of his disappearance, he was preparing to organize a major international conference that aimed to unite anti-colonial and socialist movements. That made him more than a domestic political opponent. It made him a global one. On October 29, 1965, Ben Barka was lured to a meeting in Paris under the pretense of discussing a documentary project. When he arrived, he was approached by individuals posing as French police officers. Within moments, he was taken into custody in what appeared to be an official operation. But it wasn't. What followed remains one of the most complex and controversial disappearance cases in modern history. Initial investigations quickly revealed that multiple actors may have been involved. French intelligence services, Moroccan security forces, and possibly even organized crime networks were all suspected at different points. The idea that a foreign political figure could be abducted in Paris with such coordination raised immediate concerns about high-level involvement. Yet despite the scale of the operation, the outcome was complete silence. No confirmed location, no verified body, no official explanation that fully accounted for what happened next. Over time, various theories began to emerge. Some suggested that Ben Barka was taken to a secret location, interrogated, and killed shortly after his abduction. Others claimed his body was disposed of in a way that ensured it would never be found, possibly dissolved or buried in undisclosed locations. There were also allegations that elements within French intelligence may have known about the operation in advance, or at least allowed it to happen. Trials were held. Some individuals were convicted in connection with the kidnapping. But even these legal proceedings failed to uncover the full truth. Too many pieces were missing. Too many questions remained unanswered. And perhaps most telling of all, too many people involved either refused to speak or provided conflicting accounts that made reconstruction of events nearly impossible. What makes the disappearance of Mehdi Ben Barka so enduring is not just the act itself, but the scale of the mystery surrounding it. This was not a disappearance in a remote area or under unclear circumstances. This was a highly visible operation in a major global city, involving individuals connected to powerful institutions. And yet, no definitive conclusion was ever reached. Decades later, the case is still open in the eyes of many investigators and historians. Documents continue to be requested. Testimonies continue to be analyzed, but the core question remains unchanged. What really happened to Mehdi Ben Barka? Because when someone disappears at the intersection of politics, intelligence, and international power, the truth does not just vanish. It gets buried. When you look at these disappearances individually, each one feels unique, shaped by its own context, its own timeline, and its own unanswered questions. A plane crashed surrounded by political tension. A UN Secretary General lost under suspicious circumstances. A high-profile figure vanishing without a trace. An intelligence chief fading into silence. A politician abducted in plain sight. But when you place them side by side, something more structured begins to emerge. These are not just isolated mysteries. They follow patterns. One of the most consistent patterns is the presence of power and information. None of these individuals were ordinary citizens disappearing under random circumstances. They were all connected, in different ways, to influence, knowledge, or political leverage. Presidents, diplomats, intelligence figures, opposition leaders. People who either held power or had access to information that could shift it. This immediately changes the nature of a disappearance. Because when power is involved, the number of possible explanations expands beyond accident or coincidence. It introduces the possibility of intention. Another pattern is the environment in which the disappearance occurred. Many of these cases happened during periods of instability, political crises, civil conflict, Cold War tensions, moments when information flow is disrupted, when multiple actors are involved, and when accountability becomes more difficult to enforce. In these conditions, truth becomes harder to isolate and sometimes easier to control. A third pattern is the absence of closure. In most criminal investigations, even if the case remains unsolved, there are usually clear boundaries. Known timelines, identified suspects, established facts. But in these disappearances, those boundaries remain blurred. Witnesses contradict each other. Evidence is incomplete or missing. Official reports answer some questions while raising others. This creates a space where theories multiply. Some of those theories are grounded in evidence. Others rely on speculation. But what connects them is the same underlying issue. The lack of a definitive explanation leaves room for interpretation. Another important factor is the role of state involvement or influence. In several of these cases, there are credible suggestions that governments, intelligence agencies, or politically connected groups may have had either direct or indirect involvement. This does not always mean responsibility is proven, but it changes how investigations unfold. Because when states are involved, transparency is rarely immediate, and sometimes it never arrives at all. There is also a psychological dimension to these disappearances. The human mind seeks resolution. It wants clear endings, clear causes, and clear accountability. When those elements are missing, the mystery becomes more than just a question of fact. It becomes something that lingers, something that continues to demand explanation even years or decades later. And that is why these cases endure. Not just because people disappeared, but because the truth never fully appeared in their place. Across all these stories, one final pattern becomes clear. Disappearance is not always about absence. Sometimes it is about uncertainty being left behind. Because in each of these cases, what remains is not just the memory of what happened, but the unanswered question of what didn't. Some disappearances end with answers. Others end with silence. And then there are cases like these, where the silence never really ends. Across different countries, decades, and circumstances, these stories share something deeper than mystery. They reveal how fragile certainty can be, especially when power, politics, or secrecy are involved. In each case, there was a moment when something happened. And from that point forward, the truth became harder to reach. Not necessarily because it didn't exist, but because it was never fully revealed. Samora Machel's death still raises questions about what really happened in those final moments in the sky. Dag Hammarskjöld Skingener investigations decades later, as new evidence slowly emerges but never quite completes the picture. Moussa Koussa's disappearance shows how someone can fade without a clear endpoint, especially in a world shaped by intelligence and hidden negotiations. And Mehdi Ben Barka's case remains one of the clearest examples of how a person can vanish in plain sight and still leave behind no definitive answer. Each story is different, but they all lead to the same uncomfortable realization. Not every mystery is meant to be solved. In many parts of the world, especially during periods of instability or conflict, information is not just lost. It is controlled, delayed, fragmented, sometimes buried so deeply that even time cannot fully recover it. And when that happens, the gap between what is known and what is true can remain open indefinitely. That is what makes these disappearances so powerful. It is not just the absence of the person, it is the absence of certainty. Because without certainty, stories continue to evolve, theories continue to grow, and the line between fact and speculation becomes harder to define with each passing year. For those connected to these cases, the impact is personal. Families are left without closure. Nations are left with unresolved chapters. History is left with questions that cannot be answered with confidence. And for everyone else, these stories become something else entirely. A reminder that even in a world where information is more accessible than ever, there are still moments that cannot be fully explained, events that resist resolution, truths that remain just out of reach. Because sometimes what disappears is not just a person. It is the final piece of the story. And once that piece is gone, everything else becomes a mystery.